In 2010, we got the release of the fantastic Aliens vs. Predator game, and 3 years later, in 2013, we got the release of Aliens Colonial Marines, but what exactly changed over those 3 years when it comes to attention to detail between the Marines and the Xenomorphs? And I can't think of a better place to begin than with the classic pulse rifle, which of course appears in both games, but in the AVP game, whenever you're firing the pulse rifle, of course it has the classic pulse rifle sound, but whenever you're firing it, you can actually see that the end of the barrel is actually getting red hot and begins to smoke. But on top of that, the sound of actually firing the pulse rifle in the AVP game is a bit flat when compared to the pulse rifle seen in Aliens Colonial Marines, which has more of a full sound. Not to mention when you're firing the pulse rifle in this game, there's actually little gaps in the audio when firing the weapon, and I don't know if this is intentional to make it sound more like the movies, but it's not in the AVP game. And of course the pulse rifle has the underbarrel grenade launcher in both games, but I will say the actual grenade explosion effect in the AVP game is much more impressive than what we see in Aliens Colonial Marines. Moving on now to a comparison of how it feels to actually blast xenomorphs between the two games, because in the AVP game you'll notice when actually shooting the aliens themselves are more prone to taking physical damage before actually dying. To the point of seeing injured xenomorphs crawling around on the ground and still trying to attack you. Whereas in Colonial Marines, the aliens themselves don't take any physical damage until the point of death itself, where you can see some pretty impressive looking damage decals. Though it is worth mentioning in Colonial Marines, when you're actually blasting the xenomorphs, they do get covered in pretty impressive looking blood decals, which is pretty cool. Which leads me to another interesting detail, which is actually how each game gets rid of the xenomorph bodies, whereas in the AVP game, whenever you take down an alien, eventually its acid blood will start to make it melt through the floor. Whereas in Colonial Marines, and I think it's implied that it's the acidic blood, but eventually the xenomorph corpses just kind of disintegrate. And speaking of blood, the classic xenomorph acidic blood appears in both games, but in their own unique way, as in the AVP game, whenever you kill an alien, the blood spills onto the ground and can actually burn you if you walk over the xenomorph's corpse. Whereas in Colonial Marines, the acidic blood only really takes effect when blasting xenomorphs at close range, burning away your armor and health, but what is pretty cool in Colonial Marines is that you can actually see the smoke of the burning acidic blood on your character, which is a pretty neat touch. Moving on now to a comparison of the aliens' combat behaviors, and in the AVP game you'll notice that whenever you're being swarmed by xenomorphs, the aliens tend to only fight you one at a time, as when you're fighting an alien, the other ones are slowly circling around you waiting for their turn to attack. While in Colonial Marines, the aliens have no such code of honor and have no problem at all with swarming you and attacking you all at once. Which is arguably more accurate, but I do think it's pretty creepy in AVP how they just kind of stalk you and wait their turn. Moving on now to a comparison of the facehuggers, as they both appear in each game in their own unique way. As in the AVP game, you do have an opportunity to take out the facehugger before it jumps, but if it does jump on you, it doesn't kill you, but it does do a lot of damage, but if you are low on health, it does actually kill you. Whereas in Colonial Marines, if you don't take out the facehugger and it gets an opportunity to jump, you actually enter a quick time event where you have to smash X to get the facehugger off of you, and if you're not fast enough, it does instantly kill you. Moving on now to one of my favorite differences between the two games, and that's actually how your motion tracker works between the two games, because in the AVP game, your motion tracker is always activated and showing in the bottom left-hand corner. Whereas in Colonial Marines, they made a really interesting decision to make you holster your weapon in order to get your motion tracker out, which means you have to sacrifice offensive capabilities in order to gain situational awareness. Which in turn cranks up the tension, as when you go to see where the aliens are on your motion tracker is the exact moment you can't actually fight them, which is a great thematic choice. Another pretty cool difference between the two games is actually how you use your weapons, as in the AVP game, every weapon has a secondary fire, whereas with the pistol, of course, you can shoot it, but when you use the secondary fire, it turns into a 3-shot burst. While in Aliens Colonial Marines, instead of having a secondary fire, it is interesting because it's the only Aliens game where you can actually aim down the sights of your weapon. So if you ever want to know what it's like to aim down the iron sights of a pulse rifle, Colonial Marines lets you do that. They're climbing out from below. Moving on now to a comparison of the melee fighting between the two games, and in the AVP game there's much more of an emphasis on melee in the entire game in general. Whereas not only can you and your enemy block each other's melee attacks, but a lot of the close quarters combat in the AVP game is focused on you knocking your enemy down to the ground where you can then safely blast them with your weapon. Whereas in Aliens Colonial Marines, the Xenomorphs themselves are constantly diving at you to engage in melee, but as far as your own personal melee, it's just basically used as a stun to keep the Xenomorphs at bay so that when you shoot them, you don't get hit with the acid blood. But it is worth mentioning in the AVP game, when playing as a Marine, you can't actually kill a Xenomorph with melee attacks, you just keep knocking them back down to the ground, whereas in Aliens Colonial Marines, you can kill a Xenomorph with melee attacks, and there's actually some pretty cool looking finishing animations, which is a nice touch. Another interesting detail between the two games is that even though we're fighting one of the most interesting creatures in cinematic history in these games, they also had the urge to fill some of the missions with humanoid enemies, as in the AVP game, you spend a few missions fighting Weyland-Yutani androids, whereas in Colonial Marines, you're actually fighting Weyland-Yutani mercenaries? I don't know, I guess they had to make it feel like Call of Duty somehow. Moving on now to a comparison of the fan favorite Smart Gun between the two games, and in the AVP game, whenever you equip the Smart Gun, you do get the little heads-up display, though it doesn't take up the entire screen, and whenever you're actually shooting at the Xenomorphs, it actually marks the targets through walls, which is pretty cool. Not to mention in this game, you can actually alt-fire the Smart Gun to fire it with free aim, which I don't know why you would ever do that, but you can. And of course the Smart Gun is in Colonial Marines as well, but the first thing you'll notice is that the heads-up display actually covers the entire screen this time, but when you're actually firing the Smart Gun, it doesn't mark the Xenomorphs through walls like it did in the AVP game, and there's also no free aim as well, but I don't really think that's a problem. Moving on to a comparison of another classic alien weapon, the flamethrower, and as it appears in the AVP game, it feels good to use, and whenever you actually light the aliens on fire, they start crawling around on the ground until they ultimately explode. Not to mention it has a really cool alt-fire mode where you can actually spray the gas out first and then light it with the flamethrower, creating walls of fire in the environment, which is really cool. Whereas in Aliens Colonial Marines, the flamethrower is kind of weird to use, as I don't really know if I'm actually doing damage to the enemies until I stop firing the flamethrower. Though I will say, whenever you are actually hitting an enemy with the flamethrower in this game, it does take them out a lot quicker. Which leads me to my last comparison in this video, which is actually how the aliens are playable in both of these games. Whereas in the AVP game, you play as an alien in first person, you can play as them in their own campaign, which is pretty short, but you can still enjoy it today, and of course you can play as an alien in multiplayer as well. Whereas in Aliens Colonial Marines, whenever you play as an alien, you play as an alien in third person, but sadly it's only in the multiplayer, and the multiplayer of this game is pretty dead, so if you ever want to play as a Xenomorph in this game, you gotta get a group of friends together to play LAN. Well guys, you made it to the end. Thank you for watching my direct comparison of Aliens vs. Predator versus Aliens Colonial Marines. But what I really find interesting is that, in my mind, I've always loved the AVP game. I was so hyped for that game. I got it the day it came out, and I was also very hyped for Aliens Colonial Marines. I picked that game up at a midnight launch. But what I find interesting is, having not played Aliens Colonial Marines in over a decade until I sat down to record this video, I was actually surprised at just how good it felt to actually blast Xenomorphs in that game. And even though AVP has this reputation of being a great alien or predator game, and Aliens Colonial Marines has a reputation of being just a god-awful game, what you spend 90% of your time doing between these two games is shooting aliens, and Aliens Colonial Marines felt really good, and maybe in some elements better than what we see in AVP. I just found that personally interesting. But guys, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to drop a like on it. It helps the little video reach new fans, and as I always say, that's always a good thing. I also make cool new videos like the one you're watching right now every single week, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. But guys, that's all I have, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.